I'm here in the square of Wadsworth, and we're going to try and give you a little history of Wadsworth back in the early 30s and middle 30s, where I was born and raised.
Hello, my name is Homer Baldwin, and I'm the producer of this series. I'm also going to be the cameraman, but I'm going to achieve something I've always wanted to be, the invisible cameraman, where nobody sees me, and nobody hollers, and nobody sticks themselves in front of the lens. You'll hear my voice from time to time, but that's only if I have something I think ought to be interesting. Otherwise, the show is Charlie's. And besides, I don't want you to think he's walking around the square talking to himself.
A statue standing just about where the flagpole is here, facing west. And to the left where the walk sign is, I remember a water fountain. And this gazebo at that time was made out of stone and block. It had restrooms in the bottom, on both sides, men and ladies' restrooms, and they were nice to have, but they were, in those days, quite smelly. Quite smelly. The police cruiser would always park in front of the statue there. That was the only parking for the one police cruiser that we had in Wadsworth. Then later on in years, talking about the gazebo area, to the east of the gazebo, in the grassy area at that time, during the war, during the Second World War, they fenced that off, and for the war effort, they filled it full of, you could bring your steel product, iron junk, and put it inside the fence there, and that was used for the war effort. And at the same time, just about where the water fountain out there, they had a bond bell setting up. And when people would buy their bonds, they would ring the bell, showing that another war bond was purchased. Now, during the 30s, this bandstand was used on Saturday night for the Wadsworth City Band. At that time, the band director was a Dallas Trent. And we played here just about every Saturday night. There was a band concert here in the square. And the people would come down here. They would just fill out the square and park cars. And of course, all the businesses were open at that time in the square of Wadsworth. They would come down and listen to the band concert. Yes, the downtown area was really full at that time. People used to come down here on Saturday morning and park their cars to get a good parking space near the square here to see the bandstand. And of course, all the businesses were open. There was no television at the time. Remember, we're in the days of radio, early radio, and no television. So the big thing was to come down the square of Wadsworth, sit, enjoy the band, shop a little bit, visit with the other people walking around the square, and then later on Saturday night, getting in your car and going home. But in the meantime, there were a couple popcorn peanut vendors here right on the square, two of them. one in front of the Citizen Bank and one here alongside Nielsen's Jewelry. They were on wheels. They would bring them out here on Saturday night. They would sell peanuts, popcorn, and different little candies. And they were quite popular and quite busy. And it was a great thing to be in downtown Wadsworth on Saturday night. And of course, the businesses were open most every night, but Saturday night was the big night. Here in the gazebo, here sitting on the statue, and going around the different businesses and doing business and enjoying the popcorn stand and the visitors. But this time we're going to start over at the Citizens Bank on the square. It's the corner of Main and College Street. South Main and College Street. At one time years ago, there was a set of steps with a steel railing around it that went down into the basement underneath the Citizen Bank, which housed a barber shop at one time run by Dale Woods, by cousin James Muscolini. And the steel railing, the opening was from the west to the east. You go down the steps. On Main Street here, above the Citizen Bank, there were many offices, and at one time attorneys, and there still are attorney and small offices above the Citizen Bank. One of the main things to the Citizen Bank corner was the clock on the corner. It's been here for many, many years, and that's the way most of us used to set watches or know the time of the day. If we start down the street here on Main Street, some of the buildings here, the fronts have been changed, but we will keep as much in order of the buildings as we can. And the first building here had to be the Mixer Electric building. Upstairs in this building here, into this doorway, was the band room for the Wadsworth City Band years ago, under the direction of Dallas Trent. And we practiced up there one night a week. A few of my classmates were also in the band. We were the younger ones in the band. And of course, the blue uniforms, they had to cut the bottoms down. My folks did, because they were just a little too long for us at that age playing in the city band. And next to that came the C.W. Curtis Menswear. This was Mr. C.W. Curtis, which was Dick Curtis's father. And Dick Curtis then had the store here for many years until his retirement. And it was one of the better men's store in Wadsworth. Now, next to Curtis Menswear, of course, was Palazzo's Shoe Repair. And from what I understand, Mr. Palazzo was here in the very early times with his shoe repair store, and he had been here for many years. Then it became Wadsworth Shoe Repair, and that now is a toy store. Next to that, here was the City Loan Company, and it's been here for many years. Now, the steps upstairs here were over some small offices upstairs, and many changes were made there in the years. Next here originally was a Hartman's drugstore, and then it became later on Bake's drugstore, owned by George Baker. It became quite a hangout for the students of Wadsworth. Now, you should go in there, get your nickel cokes, your milkshakes, your hamburgers, and listen to those nickel jukeboxes that would always. Sunday night was date night in Wadsworth, and the students would go to the picture show on Sunday night with their dates, and then they would end up either at Granny's drugstore up in the corner or at Bake's drugstore and have a milkshake, a hamburger, Coke, whatever, listen to jukebox, and then walk their dates on home. Every high school kid in Wadsworth, New Bake's Drugstore. It was it. Now, during the Second War, this became quite a popular place for a gentleman from Wadsworth, Dr. Melvin, who took movie pictures of servicemen either home on leave or home after leave being discharged. And they always took the photos here or up on North Pardee Street in front of Doc Melvin's home. And there were quite a assortment of pictures, and all the servicemen in Wadsworth were mostly in it. Right next to it, of course, telltale is the First National Bank, and it still looks like a bank, and I can always remember this only as a bank. Next to that came the 5 and 10 cent store. This was here for quite a few years until it moved up on to High Street, and it was busy. Mr. Alsace was one of the first owners that I remember in the 5 and 10 cent business here. Stairs over to Ben Franklin was the IOOF. And that had an outside door from the street here where you could go upstairs for the meetings. And just down, another doorway down here took you up over the stores here that were Overholt, originally Overholt and Freeburn, and then became Abrams and Mansfield. Now it is Love's Country Markets.
They used to deliver to the homes, didn't they?
They would deliver to your home.
Just call them up and...
Just call them up, and they had a young fellow by the name of Holcomb who would drive groceries as you telephone them in and bring them right to your home. And it was a great store. Right here was the alley that went in behind the buildings. Dick's Hardware. Dick's Hardware, originally the father had it. Then it went to the son, Walter Dick, and his wife worked here. It was an old-fashioned hardware with the bins, metal bins for the nails, and you could get any assortment of hardware goods in Dick's Hardware. The Allen Hartzell Dibble building at that time was Allen Hartzell and Dibble. All three from Wadsworth here. Was a real estate and insurance, and I believe the manager at that time was a Mr. Coleman, who managed the offices here. And another employee in there was Mrs. Gehring. She was one of the main secretaries in the building, of course, when it was remodeled. And this room here was originally, when I remember, the post office for Wadsworth, Ohio. It had wood-oiled flooring in there, and it was the original post office that I can remember. Of course, prior to that, the post office, I don't know. Later it became the B&B cut rate store and a sports store that our coach, Art Wright, most of the sporting equipment that we bought for the high school came through B&B store here, and it was quite a store for clothing. Any household items you could buy through the B&B cut rate drug.
I remember when the kids used to come over here with their lunch money and they would buy 3 full-size candy bars for a dime.
Yes. And this space here was an older house. And I don't exactly remember who owned this house, but it was an older house that was taken down. We thought at first it was going to be a parking lot, but I don't think it ever became anything but just a space between that and an old place here that was a shoe repair store. Now, this shoe repair store was owned by a Mr. Shernack. He had 2 boys. One of the boys' name was Ted, but both boys followed their father in that trade. The father taught him the shoemaker business. Of course, they didn't continue on with it, but it was just a small wooden structure here, up a couple of steps, and it did strictly shoe repair. Later on, this building was built here by Dale Wood. Dale Wood then sold it to one of his younger barbers, and it stayed at the barber shop for a few years Jackson Hewitt Tax Service. Now, the building on the corner here was BMI's market. Mr. Sam BMI was one of the first Italians in the city of Wadsworth. And he had the oldest son, Charles, younger one, Tony, and a daughter. All of them worked here at the grocery store. He also owned a greenhouse on Water Street where South Lyman dead end into Water Street, and he would also sell the flowers here. There were apartments upstairs, an old storeroom in the back, but at that time it wasn't used much except for the grocery stores that they sold from the front with a back door to it. But the apartments were always rented upstairs. People loved to live here in the square, Wadsworth. Okay, back in the 35s, 36s, there were two houses here. The first house on the corner belonged to a Dr. Durling. Dr. Durling was a good old-time doctor. This was in the day when doctors carried their little case with them, a little back case with them, and they had their pills right there. When they found what was wrong with you as they entered your home, because they would come to the home at that time, they would issue you the pills prescribed by them. Dr. Durling was an old-time doctor. He had a son, Jim Durling, and a daughter. And next to him was another doctor by the name of Dr. Kuntz. Now, back to the first Dr. Durling. Later on it became Kuntz, K-U-H-N, repair, electronic repair, repaired telephones, radios, anything electronic. Later on, television. Mr. Kuhn for the son Dale in the class 1945. He's now living in Florida. The next house was with Dr. Kuhn, K-O-O-N-T-Z. He was the same kind of doctor as Dr. Durling. He would dispense some pills to you as he prescribed them, as he came to your home on house calls. And I remember one incident later on in years when I was still a young fella. My mother had come up here for an examination, and Dr. Kuntz had been under the weather, and he was lying in bed with a bed cap on with a tassel on it, with his stethoscope, still checking out his patients as they came into his office. Back in the early 30s and middle 30s, there was a variation of homes along here, and one of the main homes was the Young family. And they were, I believe, the parents of the Don and Wayne Young from the Injector and the Match Company. A little business here, a little building, and it was called at that time Hamburger on the Hill. On the side of the building was a big hamburger painted on the bricks, and it said 5 cents. And that's what the cost of the hamburger was. You go in there and get hamburgers for 5 cents each. And this had been here for years. Here on Garfield Street, as you top the hill here, immediately on the right was a little area called Lincoln Place with about 5, 6 houses to the right here. And down at the end of the street on the left-hand side was the first Wadsworth Hospital that I can remember, and the nurses' home just next to it. Now, when I run into some people that say they are from Wadsworth, Ohio, we always like to talk about the old places, and we always like to mention Lincoln Place. And, of course, out on 261, Gypsy Lane. And, of course, if they don't know what I'm talking about, Gypsy Lane or Lincoln Place, I really understand that they may be living in Wadsworth, but were not originally from Wadsworth, because these places did exist, and we still think they exist. as Gypsy Lane and Lincoln Place. Here on Garfield Street, the building here on was the Ohio Match Shop Gym. At one time, they had basketball games and boxing matches. I attended both basketball games as a small boy and the boxing matches. Now this was all a great place to see the sports, except for one night, a gentleman from Wadsworth here got peeved to another gentleman from Wadsworth and put an ice pick into him, and that abruptly ended the Match Shop Gym for the Ohio Match Company. They stopped all activity right at that time, real quick. Now down here, the Match Company, the Ohio Match Company, was probably one of the biggest match companies in the entire country. Part of the office where you see the parking lot now and the van park were in the offices. At one time, when I worked for Western Union, delivering the telegrams, the main place I would have to go to would be the Match Shop or the Ohio Injector across the street, back up the hill, back to Western Union. About that time, we're all ready with another batch of telegrams, back down to the Match Shop office, and Injector office, and back up to Western Union. I would go up and down this hill many times in a day, just delivering messages and telegrams to these two, of course, big companies here in Wadsworth, Ohio. On the east side of Main Street, this fence had been here for years, and this was alongside the Ohio Injector Company. There was a space between the fence and the buildings of about probably around 6 or 8 or 10 feet. And on one occasion, a gentleman was coming down the hill here and in some way miscued with his automobile and went through the fence and wedged between the building and the sidewalk. The drop down there was probably around 10, 12 feet, and the car was wedged in there. And at that time, Mr. Homer Fiscus, with his Buick wrecker, was ordered to come down here, and he picked up the car, and after about a number of hours, which made a great show for all of us up here watching him pull that vehicle out of that wedge and back up onto the street. The gentleman that went down there was Mr. Metting, and he was not injured. He was not injured. He was an older gentleman at that time, but no injury to him at all. This building originally was built as an injector office, and later on it became Josephine Patty's beauty salon. And a number of houses through here, of course, have been taken down now. The next house here, when I first remembered, it belonged to a Mr. and Mrs. Welch. They had a son in my brother's office, in my brother's class, and 2 daughters. Patty Welch was one of them. And for years, this Injector Hill was something to climb every day, going back and forth to high school. This empty site here was the Kane Mansion. Mrs. Kane lived here. She had a chauffeur. It was a beautiful home. And when they tore the home down, most of the marble inside was taken out and is now at Rowega Country Club. So the marble you see out there came from the old Kane Mansion here on top of the Injector Hill, what we call the Injector Hill. Now next door to that was a home that Dr. Durling moved from the corner of what Crusoe and Main down to this building that's standing here right now. His office was right here on the end, which is now a barber shop, and looks like it may be closed now. After Mr. Durling, my father purchased this home, and the office part became my bedroom. Now that office part had no basement underneath it, and in the wintertime, it was like a deep freeze, but I certainly slept well there. I like it cold to sleep in, and it was great. Now here on this empty site here, where you see the grass over there, was just a building, a little brick building about the size of that grass, and it was the Hilltop gasoline station. The original owner, I cannot remember who owned it, but later on in years it was purchased by Charles BMI from BMI's grocery store, and he ran the station here for quite a few years, and of course now the building's down. The site here was the old Methodist church back in the 30s and 40s until the high school purchased it and made music class and some classes out of it. And of course later on they took the church down and it became a playground parking lot that exists to this day. The home you see here has been here for years. The building was put in by Victor Electric. Later on, as you can tell, it's a newer type building. You'll find Victor Electric several places in the square of Wadsworth. Our Central High School, the auditorium, and the high school. This walk to the high school one day was made much longer for me when I was caught playing hooky by my father. My father drove me up here and parked in front, and I got out of the car and ready to walk up the walk, and he says, "Not yet." He waited until this thing was crowded with students. Then he took me out of the car, walked me by hand up this walk, which made it a mile longer because all the students were watching and looking at my father holding my hand and bringing me to school. And of course he was making sure I got there and making sure I was embarrassed and possibly wouldn't play hooky again. I'm not so sure it really worked that well. Now in this parking lot here used to be a big, beautiful tourist home. And I remember a gentleman by the name of Bert Koppelberg. He looked like a Kentucky colonel. He had snow white hair and a white goatee and beard, and he always dressed immaculate and always a first-class gentleman in his speech and in his manner. Now, the building here was Dale Wood's barbershop again. Dale Wood had been in several places here in the square of Wadsworth, and he had a cousin of mine by the name of Jim Muscolini working with him. After Wood's barbershop became a bike shop and Western Auto. The next building here was Miller Jones Shoe Store. A fellow by the name of Shooky run it, and he'd been here for years, and it was in business for years, strictly Buster Brown shoes. I remember Buster Brown shoes, and I remember those high tops you could buy with a knife pocket on the side. Now that was a pride of every young boy around. The next store I could remember here in the 30s and into the 40s was Sam Klein Clothing Store. Sam and his wife ran this business for years here. Next to that was later on, it became a little restaurant. Now, it was a wooden structure, and at that time, they moved the wooden structure out into the street, built out of the brick structure here. There were two stores in it, and they moved the wooden building after it was built, and they went back into business down to the south end, and it became Frank Giles Meat Market. That was second home to quite a few of us in Wadsworth. It was Bake's pool room. They had about 4 or 5 pool tables in there. No drinking, just soft drinks. And there were steps going up into the pool room, and there was a railing there we could sit on and watch people walking around Wadsworth if we weren't playing pool. Later on, a fellow by the name of Ab Gross, bought the pool room, and later on, when it became Tubasing's Dry Goods, Ab Gross moved down these steps and put the pool room down underneath the building in the basement. Now, Tubasing's was here for years, and Mr. and Mrs. Tubasing ran it and did a great business. It was a real popular business in Wadsworth. They had dry goods, clothing, cloth, sewing material, everything is there. And upstairs was the American Legion. And it's still here. The American Legion is still upstairs in this building. As a matter of fact, the American Legion owns the whole building and will soon move part of its facilities down where you're seeing the construction being done here. One time, the building here that houses the VFW was G&H Drugstore. It had been here for quite a few years. Now, in the middle 30s, early 40s, this was started as an Isley store, where they had the big, long dip of ice cream. And the first manager remembered here was a fellow by the name of Hensel. He had been here with his wife working here for years, and later on you probably all remember his son, C. David Hensel, who was the judge of this municipal court in Wadsworth, Ohio. This is quite a place to go in and get your ice cream, get a few sandwiches, but the main thing was the ice cream and a long top on that ice cream, banana, rainbow, quite a few colors. It was quite a popular place for the people of Wadsworth and the students to get ice cream cones.
Yeah, I remember it especially, sometimes you could double your bet. You could go in there and you get a Klondike. And I don't remember whether they were on a stick or whether they were just that, but they broke it in half. If it had a pink center, you got another one free.
You got another one free.
You talk about a 6-year-old kid walking a foot off the ground.
Oh, that was wild to get a different free one. Of course, then we have the alleyway here, which used to go back to a couple of storerooms back in the alleyway. This store was Zarro's here. Zarro had a little counter where you could order sandwiches, get your newspapers, get your coffee and donuts in the morning. And it had been here for years until it moved to Orville, Ohio. Now, one of the things I can remember about Zarro's that scared me for quite a few months was the fella used to bring the donuts up here and leave them in boxes before Mr. Zarro would open up in the morning. And one morning, a couple of my fellow students and I came up and we had an early breakfast of a donut apiece. After that, for a few months, we worried every time we seen the police chief, who was at that time not called the police chief. All he said was, Tommy Lucas. Everybody in town knew that Tommy Lucas was the police chief. And I thought, he's going to find out about those 3 or 4 missing donuts, and we'll probably end up in jail. So even as high school students, we still worried about doing something like that. And we never did it again. Here on the corner was Nielsen's jewelry store. Mr. Nielsen had been here for years. There was a slight incline to his front door, and there was a set of scales right in the middle of there before you reached the door, and you could put your penny in there and get weighed. A set of stairways led up to the offices upstairs, including the Dr. Baldwin, who was a dentist here, and he was one of the few state representatives from this area. The other one was Jerry Hall.
I'll tell you about Dr. Baldwin. Homer Liebert told me a long time ago about Dr. Baldwin, who was my grandfather. He was very civic-minded. Homer Liebert delivered the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Homer Library had to pay the piper for it because every day he delivered the paper, my grandfather would put him in the dentist chair, scan the headlines, and for 3 minutes give him a prehistory shot on how what was in the paper was going to affect him or his children.
Here on the corner, prior to Nielsen's jewelry store, was Fales Drugstore. Ike Fale was the owner of the Fales Drugstore. Later on, went into real estate in the city of Wadsworth here, or in the town of Wadsworth. We like to call it a town instead of a city. We like to just stay just about as big as it is now. As I say, at the time of the 30s, it was about population of about 5,000 to 6,000. Now it's grown quite a bit. These were 2 separate stores. This store later on became Lattrick Shoe Store, and it stayed as Lattrick Shoe Store run by Mr. and Mrs. Lattrick for quite a few years, up until recent years there. And then, of course, it closed down, and now is entirely from the corner down offices. Now here on the corner, rounding the corner onto Broad Street, was an outside entrance to the downstairs of this part of the building here. And down there it housed a barber shop. The earliest barber I remember down there was a fellow by the name of Art Hartman. And he had a barber shop down there. And several other people, of course, later on, kept it as a barber shop. This had an outside railing here and an outside entrance. You went down the steps from east towards the corner. The railing was quite a few people used to use it as a place to just sit on the railing and just enjoy the people of Wadsworth, enjoy the small amount of traffic we had coming through Wadsworth in those days. As I remember, this door was never here at the time in the 30s, middle 30s and late 30s. But the next building here housed Curtis Electronics. He was one of the first TV salesmen or sales store and installation I remember in Wadsworth. He sold the TVs here, and a fellow by the name of Sam Pupil worked for him, and they not only installed a television at your home, but Sam would get on your roof and install that first Lazy X antenna. That was the only antenna at those times, and he would have to get up there, install it, drop the wire down, hook it up, and then they would holler up and down without two-way radios which way to turn that antenna to get the best picture on your television. Next to that, in the next storeroom here, was a storeroom, and this was run by Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins lived on the south end, but he had a small restaurant in here, and he also did repairs on typewriters. He did repairs on typewriters, and had a good business going on typewriters, and a quick place to grab a sandwich, cup of coffee, donut in the morning. These all thrived in Wadsworth, these little small restaurants and small businesses. This present white stone building, in those days, was not here. It was built later on. The alleyway was here. This is the Strand Theater. Many, many movies here. And bank night was on Wednesday night, and on Wednesday night, it was packed. Inside the old Strand Theater, here on the square, and this is going to be converted into a business theater for presentations. Right now, they're still working heavy on it, but the old stage is here, the old screen opening is up there, and up above me, up the top of the old area for the projection room. Starting here, going to be on down range, down into the stage, and this part now there will be basement. The old projection room opening is still up there. You open the door there for the theater. And as you walk through here, this is the old stage. And on Wednesday night here years ago was bank night. The place was completely packed on bank night. I worked here originally as a usher, and then I was really did job in Hague. I was set up into ticket taking for the gentleman who was from Wadsworth at that time by the name of Al White, who lived out on College Street. A Mr. Sykes and Mrs. Sykes owned it from nearby Sandusky, owned the theater, and of course the other theater, which was the Star Theater. And Eddie Mills was the manager of both theaters. The projectionist that I can remember up here was a Mr. Yoppie from Wadsworth. He was the projectionist here with one other projectionist hired later down to the Star Theater. Our next building here was the Park Cafe, and it had fish sandwiches on Friday nights that were out of this world. If you didn't want to go into the front entrance and pick up your fish dinners or sandwiches, you could go around the back and come in the back entrance. Pete Eiselhart, for a while, had run this Park Cafe, and then the family of Rogers took it over. This building, as I remembered in the 30s and the early 40s, was the Wadsworth News. And Nellie Harder was an editor here, and I think at one time she owned part of this. Later on, the Wadsworth News merged with the Banner Press on Wautroosa, and it became the Wadsworth News Banner. Now, you may not think that alleys have any stories, but there's quite a few stories concerning this alley as you go down between the theater and between Collins's typewriter repair and restaurants. And one of the earlier buildings down here that's been remodeled quite a bit was a building that a gentleman from Wadsworth either owned or rented, and his name was Gomer. Quite an ice skater, but he was also a Cree surgeon, he advised. And he painted a sign over the opening to his large doorway to his business, and it said his name and Cree surgeon. Now, he ran out of space, so the surgeon part went around the corner and downhill so we could get it all in there. But he was a Cree surgeon, and basically I remember as a crewing officer. This alley was used for service to some of the stores there by small trucks. And to the left was a row of small wooden open garages. And there they housed some of the cars that people had. But the main thing they housed was one of the peanut wagons that was on the square owned by a Mrs. Moore, M-O-O-R-E. Now, Mrs. Moore popcorn little stand on wheels was in front of the Citizen Bank building. And she at that time had a couple young fellas, one of them I believe was her grandson, that would move it after she closed on Saturday night, down Main Street, up to the old school alley, beside the Central High School, and back into one of these little garages. And one of those Saturday nights, the two boys and Mrs. Moore's son were pushing the wagon back there and start pushing it a little bit too fast, and the son was holding like the horse would the lines up, and they pushed him right down over the injector hill. Luckily, nobody was injured. Mrs. Moore was not in the wagon at that time. Some way they got it back up the hill and back in to where it belonged back here in the garage, but I'm sure they won't forget that. Now, here was a large building that was an automobile dealership, and I believe first owned by a family by the name of Garshman. Then it became Forey Wright's Buick Garage. He had a head mechanic by the name of Houston, lived up on Lyman Street. He had been with him for years and stayed with him right to the end. Next to Forey Wright's Buick Garage was a little welding shop owned by a fellow by the name of Ernie Miller. Now, Ernie Miller also was a boxer, and I seen him box one time at the Match Shop gym. One of the stories I remember about Mr. Wright, who was a great businessman, he sold a Buick to Mr. Joe Bender at one time, and after several years, one of the headlights went out, and Joe came in here one morning and said, "Forey, one of the headlights is out on the car." Forey said, "That shouldn't be," so he contacted Mr. Houston. He said, "Mr. Houston, change the headlight in this car free of charge. It burned out already." It was only several years old. One Sunday afternoon, after watching the matinee movie, I came out of the alleyway here and out of the Strand Theater and walked back through here to go down Lyman Street, and H.J. Hall Trucking Company was right here. A large building, and it had caught fire. And I wanted to see the fire department, and all of a sudden, up came the fire truck. Tex Plow was one of the firemen, and they came to the fire. Mr. Hall had arrived just as soon as the fire broke out. He was called, and I watched the burning of H.J. Hall's trucking company. Now, the job was done great by the small Wadsworth Volunteer Fire Department because they put the fire out, and I don't believe that much damage was done to the Hall Trucking Company. Hall Trucking Company, by the way, had one of the oldest permits issued by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Okay, originally here on the corner was White's Golf Service Station. He had it for years, and then, of course, the next owner was Sam Weldy from Wadsworth, Ohio, and he owned it for many, many years, quite a bit good service, and then on to his son, Gary Weldy. Next to that was the Ella Everhart Library. The Wadsworth Library was in a big green wooden structure next to the gas station. The library was, like I say, a big green wooden structure. Ella Everhart either contributed to the City of Wadsworth or the City of Wadsworth purchased it as probably one of their first libraries that I can remember in the 30s. And in the 40s until they built the new library on the same site there. Now this was the driveway that existed, brought the cars in, behind and into Hayes Arnold Chevy Garage. That was the first I remember was Hayes Arnold Chevy Garage. Let me tell you a little story about Hayes Arnold Chevy Garage. One time they advertised that there would be a car started, remote control, and we all gathered, everybody gathered inside the garage showroom in front, and certainly they did have a car there, and they started it remote control. And I thought to myself, oh, this was before high school, and I thought to myself, what a wonder. This is one of the wonders of this world right now, starting a car without any person being inside of it. Now, next to Hayes Arnold, there was an alleyway in here, and back behind the alley was one of the first locations of the Wadsworth Fire Department, and the fire chief was a fellow by the name of Lank Weinsheimer. That was an old chain-driven fire engine. You could hear that chain churning away when he'd come out of there and pull out onto Broad Street here en route to a fire. Also here in front was a housing of a diner that was moved at one time from the corner of South Lyman Street and Broad Street here, and it was here then for quite a few years. The next structure I remember here was a large wooden structure that had a partly exposed basement and up quite a few steps upstairs. There were a few little shops here, but the main shops were Smith Dry Cleaners and Trent Tailors. They were housed in there for years. Later on, Smith Cleaners moved up off High Street and still was owned by Smith, which was Sid Smith. Now, next to the Cleaners and the Tailor was Wadsworth Bakery. This was a foreign person that made bread and donuts that were out of this world. He'd been in business for years here, and he was the last business I remember in there, outside of the next building, which was Mr. Jackson, who was later on one of the council members of the Wadsworth City Hall, and his brother was also a barber, and Sid Crooks was the third barber in Jackson's barber shop that had been here for years. Sid lived up on Lyman Street, and the Jacksons lived out on Grandview. Next was a little brick building that had no windows, and it was in this alleyway. There was an alleyway here between the Brenneman building and this little structure, and back in that alleyway, the Beacon Journal used to deliver the newspapers there for the newspaper boys to pick up their newspapers and deliver them around the city of Wadsworth. Also, in that little structure, there used to be a handyman around Wadsworth who was a giant of a man, and they called him Big Andy.
I think he was a Russian.
Big Andy was Russian descent, but he would do the handiwork around the square of Wadsworth and, of course, around the town itself. At that time, I'm not sure if it was the Akron Beacon Journal or the Akron Times Press. Of course, now it's only the Akron Beacon Journal. The Times Press went out of business. Now, the next large building is on the corner of Broad Street and High Street was Brenneman's Drugstore, and of course, upstairs housed offices. Had a side doorway here, just about the place I'm pointing here. You go in the side or in the front, and of course, this is a famous place for the students and the people of Wadsworth also, because you could get your Coke, your sandwich, your sundae, your soda, everything in your prescriptions and your sundries in Brenneman's Drugstore, owned by Mr. Glenn Brenneman. The other thing I knew about Glenn Brenneman was, and I heard this from his wife, that he put her through Ohio State University. And when she was at Ohio State University, she was there as a student at the same time they finished building the Ohio State Stadium. And as students, when they finished the construction of the stadium, the students were asked to help clean up the surrounding construction leftovers around the stadium, and she did tell me that she did help with that. One of the first druggists, I'm sure the old-timers remember here at Brenneman's Drugstore, was Merle Jelinek. And the other druggist was a fellow by the name of Bob Brown. Now, they stayed with him, I believe, right on up till the end, when it no longer became Brenneman's Drugstore. Now, here at Brenneman's Drugstore, known as Brenny's, he had booths in there, Cokes, milkshakes, and Mr. Brenneman taught you how to make that milkshake, and woe is you if you didn't make it according to his specifications. Now, the students used to hang out here, and of course, a lot of the townspeople, not only students, but all the townspeople hung out here for their Cokes, and of course, there was a drugstore, and of course, here in front was a magazine section, and it had probably every funny book that you could ever think of. It probably had one of the biggest collections of funny books in town. And we used to come in and use it sometimes as some sort of a library. Instead of purchasing them, we would just read them and lean against the rack, read them a little bit, and then leave. Now, upstairs over Brenny's, the offices that I remember at that time was a Dr. Wolf, who was an optometrist, and I believe the AAA was up there for a short time above Brenny's. Now, starting next door, we had B's Dress Shop, and it was well known in town. It was a better dress shop. It was called B's. And just up the street from B's, in a little shop in here, was Ray Hebron had a dry cleaners called LaSalle Cleaners. And it was in These buildings have all changed. The front of them have changed, but it was in here. And next to LaSalle Cleaners was Acme Store. The Acme Store that's now Acme out of Akron, and it was owned and operated by a fellow by the name of Mr. Mosier. The family operated it, and of course the son, Bob Mosier, recently retired from Knapp's Firestone down the street in College. Now, in here, in these buildings, also was Rayner's Grocery Store. It was a cell phone grocery store, small grocery, and there were many groceries around the square town here. Just at that time, not too much of big supermarkets, just small grocery stores. Also, at one time, there was a small cafe here. Later than Raines, I believe. This had a big cover over the top that came out into the street here. And then there's this building here, which is a couple stories high. There's our first telephone company that I can remember was Star Telephone Company. And it was something to be able to go up the top of the steps once in a while and watch the operators with the headphones on and the plugging in the different numbers that people would call, because you would lift up your phone, you would say the number 3478 or 246, and she would plug it in for you. And I thought that was something out of this world to be able to watch her do all these things with these phone jacks up there.